Hey, it's October, and that can only mean one thing: the latest from Marshall Enterprises in the Bataille series. This year it is the Battle of Bautzen in 1813. I wonder how many more Octobers we're going to have releases from Marshall. They've been doing it pretty steadily for a long time now. Can't do it forever. So I keep trying to enjoy what I can while I can. As typical for Marshall, it's a big battle. This is the standard package that they provide. A numbered box. Color organization charts for the armies. There are multiple sheets of counters, plus some standard markers, which if you have any La Bataille, you don't need these. And then there are 7 giant map sheets in the Marshall's artwork style. Now, 6 of the sheets form the major main battle, and there's 1 sheet that is used for a reconnaissance in force that occurred 2 days before the main battle, and so it acts as a standalone game that you can play. Give you a chance to have a smaller footprint for those who are space challenged. But the main battle will incorporate all 6 of the maps, kind of on the same footprint of Austerlitz or Wagram in years past. Now, also typical for Marshall is no printed rules. It is all provided electronically, which is just fine by me because I want to search through PDFs rather than thumb through paper. But there's instructions on the README that tell you how to download the electronic rules that then you can decide to print up any way you like. Marshall is very fond of the flippin' books application. I kind of hate it, but fortunately they did provide a pure PDF version. That's really nice because they're searchable, and then I can use tools to divvy them up into small chunks, scenarios, special rules, things like that. Makes it easier to handle and put on a tablet, or just focus one bit of searching on one specific area. Just a quick look at some of the counters. This is a battle that takes place in the spring of 1813. That's after the disaster in Russia. So you don't have a very good French army here. A number of allies, Bavarians, some of the Germans and Italians, and a large number of these provisional battalions. French that were, culled together very quickly, poorly trained, poor capabilities, but a lot of them. And much of the battle would be fought just with those forces. There's very little cavalry, as you can see, even on the counter sheets here. Much of it is concentrated into the reserve cavalry corps, not nearly as much allotted to the individual infantry corps as is typically done in Napoleon's armies. Now the coalition consists of the Prussians and the Russians at this point, and the Russians have been fighting for a long time. You'll see a large number of rather small battalions on their side, but plenty of good cavalry, plenty of artillery. These are not porn stashes, those are entrenchment markers, which will play a pretty big part in this battle. The Prussians are actually in pretty decent shape. They have cavalry, artillery, pretty good infantry, but there's just not as many of them. They haven't had as much time to mobilize, and weren't able to do it quite as effectively given the French boot on their neck at the beginning of this war. Here's the Imperial Army, ready to go on its order of battle sheet. For the most part, the counters and the OB look good. I see one really particular error. It's right here. This guard battalion We have an 8 increment regiment, 4 increment battalion, and then, fortunately, an 8 increment battalion. Pretty sure that should be 4, since the specific side does look correct. But otherwise, that's the only real mistake I see. There are a number of cases where we see the specific sides, the counters being a little different from the OOB, and largely it's the movement potential has been decreased almost across the board of many of the units. You don't have to convince me that this grand army is not really the grandest army we've ever seen out of the French, so diminishing their movement potential a little bit to show their lesser capabilities, I think, is pretty fair. Otherwise, we do see a great number of provisional as well as Allied forces. A lot of German and Italian here. Much of the cavalry is actually very weak. This reserve cavalry corps is not the vaunted formation we're used to seeing. And some of the larger formations are actually German or Italian. So the French side of things is a little weak. Remainder of the army. This would be more or less the left wing, Ney's left wing, so the large Third Corps, but still a lot of less capable French units in these forces. And a heavy reliance on the minor allies, lots of Germans and Italians. So a big army, weak in cavalry, and not especially capable infantry. And the 6 coalitions, starting with the Russians. This is a typical Russian army with a lot of small infantry battalions, a whole lot of big artillery, fair amount of good cavalry sprinkled about, especially the big concentration here in the reserves. Plenty of Cossacks to give the Imperials fits. Most of the printed OOB looks correct, or at least consistent. However, there are a few spots where units don't have a place on the graphical OOB here. There's only one place where I see a bit of a discrepancy. The graphical spot gives the 12th and 22nd Jaeger regiments 1 battalion. The written OOB describes them simply as the 12th and 22nd regiment, so it's not clear if these second battalions are supposed to be part of those regiments or maybe incorrectly included in the counters. I figure these two little units are not going to tip the balance of the battle, so put them on the board, give the coalition a little bit of help. And where we see a really nice formation here is the Grenadiers and the Guard in the reserve. So they have pretty good punch, decent artillery support. They'll probably be able to make a nice fight of it. Moving along to the Prussian side. They're not a bad force, there's just not enough of them. There's a whole lot of white space here on this OOB. So there's basically 4 formations and cavalry. They have decent infantry, decent cavalry, decent artillery. Again, just not very much of it. It's going to be hard for them to hold too much ground, but I think what they can cover, they will be able to hold. A little bit of decent cavalry in the Guard there. Again, for the most part, the OOB here is consistent. There's only 1 cavalry regiment that doesn't have a place on the presentation here. This is a pretty good map of the battle. It shows the rough terrain they're fighting in with the woods, the hills, even the water features. If you're not a student of this period, this could be kind of an obscure battle, but it actually is pretty interesting in the context of the spring campaign of 1813. Now the Tsar, who is more or less in command of the coalition army, has decided that Napoleon intends to turn his left and force him away from the Austrian frontier and potentially
disrupt the entry of Austria into the Sixth Coalition. So he has stacked his army very heavily on the left, with the Prussians holding the right. Napoleon has a different idea. He wants to fix the army in place and swing around with a wide enveloping maneuver to cut them off and to destroy them. He doesn't have the army he used to have. Doesn't have the cavalry, the ability to pursue after a victory, so he needs to destroy them in place. So the stage seems to be set for the French to capture a large victory. The Tsar is focused on his left, ignoring his right, and right where Napoleon wants him. But unfortunately, the French Marshal Ney doesn't quite have the grasp of the plan, and instead of a wide flanking maneuver, he kind of crashes directly into the coalition right, giving the coalition a chance to escape. Now let's see how these maps depict these features in the game.
Here's just one section of the map to illustrate the position that the Allies have created. They've been retreating for about 2 weeks or so since the opening major battle of this campaign at Lutzen or Großgorschen, and they have had an opportunity to pick this spot and prepare it. So these are some redoubts printed on the map, and then the Allied player also gets to choose to place some entrenchments. There are also these kind of fortified positions in the towns where they've had an opportunity to build up some better defenses. Kind of see how that looks like a log in placement. Obviously that'll be good for infantry and artillery. There are special rules surrounding trying to assault it from the front sides. So they make them very significant positions. Another interesting aspect of this battlefield and these maps are these giant ponds. These are carp ponds, sort of a commercial fishery, combined with the streams and the swamps, make certain areas of the battlefield very difficult to maneuver. There are special rules that prevent movement into, but also destruction of units that have to route into these areas. So you have to be very careful about getting your back stuck against these ponds. And maneuvering around them will be, pose a good defensive position for the Allies and a tough area to funnel their troops through for the French. This is the standalone map for the sort of the opening engagement of the battle. It really takes place over 3 days, but the Allies are awaiting the French in their position. As the French are approaching, the Allies saw a chance to strike at them and sort of sallied forth and attack them in this area here. So it makes for a nice standalone game, kind of a core-on-core appetizer for the main battle. This map doesn't connect to the rest of the battlefield, so it makes it a little more compact, but it has many of the same features, principally the ponds and the woods. I don't know how artful this is here, but this little path through the woods is a special wooded pathway. It lessens the terrain cost of moving through the woods there, so you can have an opportunity to pounce on your opponent if you like. But there are kind of going to be two distinct areas of the fight here. One around Königswarth there, and one over here by Wessig. There's an I in there, so I suppose it would be Weissig. But there are two specific scenarios covering both aspects of this fight, and then one that combines the two into one battle on one map here. And here's the map in its full glory, all 6 sheets. Very, very large, actually larger than the Wagram maps by just a few inches. About 103 inches in length. So that takes up quite a bit of table space.
This perspective is coming from the coalition side, looking across to the French side. Cardinal directions are basically about due northwest, looking this way, and southeast behind us to the bottom of the map. So it's a giant map, even for the forces involved. Lots of woods, hilly areas. Kind of make out the line of the fortified positions that the Allies have created. Very heavily on the left here, and a whole lot more open space on the right. There's just kind of the tiniest hint of Bautzen up there in the distance. We'll take a tour of the opening setup for the grand battle scenario. This is the historical situation. It takes place, well, it starts around mid-morning. So the actual battle starts first thing in the morning with an attack on the right here, which has already occurred by this point in the setup, so you see it well underway. This is the 12th Corps, helped by the 11th Corps. Facing Miloradovic's Russians, as well as quite a substantial part of the Russian Guard Grenadier Reserve. So the Tsar is already committed very heavily to his left. Moving just a little bit further, we're at the far right of the French line, moving towards the left. And this would be the southwest portion of the field, moving towards the northeast. Kind of see some heavy woods, streams, woods, and then the beginnings of the heavy earthworks to hold not only the thin Russian infantry, but also those big, heavy Russian artillery pieces. So the battle's heavy there on the right, coming further northeast. The French 6th Corps is gathering here. Again, across from them are heavy earthworks, artillery on the heights there. So the coalition left and center is being held very strongly. As we move towards the center, we'll start to see the Prussians coming into view around the village of Krekvitz and the heights here, which were very hotly contested. I'll run out of space here on my table, but the 4th Corps, which is the center of the French, is just arriving. They will arrive over the next couple of hours, and this will be sort of the hammer blow that Napoleon hopes will drive back the coalition. But just look how terrible this terrain is with all the swampy and carp ponds. It can be hard to navigate. But generally the Prussians are in pretty good shape here. They're backed up by some of their Guard heavy cavalry. There's also some places that are very thinly held. No reason to pile up behind the carp ponds. There's some spots here that are held, but aren't necessarily directly contested. This is where we get to the far sort of left wing of the French, the northeast of the line. And we see the massive 3rd Corps here. So on this side, Ney has already begun his battle several hours before. The coalition has committed Barclay here. He has a fairly good force, and they have more or less stymied them at this point in the battle. And there's still a fair amount of French to arrive. The 5th Corps and the 7th Corps, such as it is, still have to arrive on this left wing. The 4th Corps, the rest of Bertrand's men, have to arrive in the center along with the Guard. Now, as for the coalition, their army in its entirety is on the field. No more help coming. The French also have their reserve cavalry, such as it is. I don't even see it listed anywhere in the scenario. Setups or reinforcements, so I don't know, I guess it's not part of the game.
I have to investigate that a little further. We play to win the game. Now, the only historically significant outcome to this battle is either for the coalition to survive and bring on the entry of the Austrians, or for the French to utterly destroy this army, break the coalition, and keep the Austrians, neutral allied. So the challenge is how to represent those concerns in a grand tactical game that doesn't care a bit about anything other than winning this particular battle. And the way that's accomplished is through the Russian artillery. The scenario basically describes the objective, which is to force the coalition to retreat and prevent their artillery from getting away. So that can either be by destroying the artillery or by cutting it off and keeping it from retreating towards this village right here. So the French have a strong incentive to act historically, that is to attempt a sweeping maneuver, get behind the coalition lines, prevent them from retreating. The coalition have a similar historically relevant objective, which is to protect their line of retreat here. And that means defending their left and center, which is more or less the way they prosecuted the battle historically. It'd be nice if the scenario specifically described the concept of a general retreat. Instead, it's just kind of implied by a few things. First is that you can't actually move the Russian heavy artillery pieces more than 10 hexes from their starting positions. I think that's exclusive of any that you may have set up in reserve, but until you've declared this thing called a general retreat. Also, the timing of that declaration will shift the victory levels either for or against the French or coalition. So the earlier in the day you declare your general retreat, meaning you're going to move your artillery pieces, shifts it towards the French. If you can hold out later in the day, that would shift it toward the coalition. So the coalition is encouraged to stay and fight for as long as possible to get the bigger victory outcomes. So with the stage set, there's nothing left to do but to start pushing some counters, throwing some dice, and see how this thing plays out.